And then we're going to talk a little bit about the trip. Not sure where all these people are, but we'll figure it out. Last thing we talked about, if I remember correctly, was the civil rights issues during the Franklin Roosevelt presidency and the Mary McLeod Bethune story, right? Okay, we're going to talk today about how the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt helped farmers in America, because farmers were a group of people that were really in a world of hurt after the Depression. And I personally believe, I'm not from a farming family or don't have any interest in the farming business as far as personally, but I think if our American farmers aren't doing well, it affects our economy all the way down like a set of dominoes. And so Roosevelt realized when he took over the presidency that he had to figure out what to do with these farmers. Now, when Roosevelt became president, 40% of all American farmers were mortgaged. When Roosevelt took office, 40% of all American farmers were mortgaged. Now, does anybody in here know what that means? What's a mortgage? No, you might have had it. Don't be bashful.
It's like when they take longer time, like if they mortgage a house, it takes longer time. Wait, is that when big people say?
No, you're way ahead of the game. You're there. A mortgage is, for example, when I buy a house, I borrow money to pay for it. That's a mortgage. Now, Maddie's getting to what happens if you don't pay that mortgage, which we'll get to. But a mortgage is where you buy property, or a house, or a farm, and you finance it. And you make a payment, right, on that? Okay? In a mortgage payment, what is in the mortgage? What are you paying for in the mortgage? Anybody know? Anybody know what you're paying for? Well, first of all, you're paying your principal. And your principal is how much you borrowed. So if I borrow $100,000 to buy a house, part of my payment, my mortgage payment, is the principal. How much I borrowed, $100,000. What else are you paying in that payment? Interest, right? Because this bank or this mortgage company is not giving you money for nothing. That's what they do for a living, right? So they charge you, I don't know, on a home 5% interest, so you pay interest also. What else do you pay in that mortgage payment normally? What else is in there? What else do you have to pay when you own property in this country? Yeah, property tax. So like my house payment, I bought a house quite a while ago when I first moved here. I paid $180,000 for it. And I borrowed the money over 15 years. Most people will borrow over 30 because your payment's less, right? But in my mortgage payment, I pay for the principal, I pay for the interest that they're charging me to loan me the money, and I pay for my property tax, which is about $900 a year. Now that's a really interesting story because my son lives in Bozeman, Montana. And he called me the other day and he says, geez, Dad, what are your property taxes on your home? I said, about $900 a year, and he said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, well, what are yours? He said, I just got my tax bill, $4,900 a year. That's Bozeman, the higher tax base, okay? Property worth more in Bozeman. So what I mean by a mortgage is 40% of American farms in this country, when Roosevelt took office, owed money on their farm. Now, to be honest with you, that's pretty good. I'll bet you if you looked at today, right today, of all the farms in this country, I bet the percentage of those being mortgaged that have a loan on them would be way higher. I'd say 60% probably or more. I don't know that for sure, but that'd be a guess. So, when we had the Depression, and these people lost their jobs, and businesses closed, and we had more supply than demand, what happened to farmers? They weren't making any money. And when you don't make your money, when you don't make money, Maddie, and you don't pay your mortgage, what do? They take your property, okay? So 40% of farmers in this country, when Roosevelt took office, had mortgages, and most had lost their farms because they couldn't make the payments. Now, when you lose your farm, you don't only lose your employment, what else do you lose? Your home, yeah. So you think about that. So Roosevelt said, wait a minute, man, we have got to get these farmers back in business, because if we don't get them in business, everything's going to domino poorly. So what he did early in his administration in 1933 is he established a financial program for farmers known as the Farm Credit Administration. So in 1933, seeing that farmers were in trouble, he formed the Farm Credit Administration. Now, what the Farm Credit Administration was going to do, Carter, is lend these farmers money to do two different things. This is what they could do with the money, okay? So the idea behind the Farm Credit Administration is they're going to loan farmers money for two reasons. Now let me ask you this question. If you were one of these people that did not have your farm mortgage, you still owned your farm, but you weren't making any money, what might you need money for if you still own the farm?
Supplies.
Yeah, like what? Seed, fertilizer, equipment. So farmers borrowed money if they owned their property to buy seed, fertilizer, equipment, etc. Okay? The people that lost their farms, what did they borrow money for? I know you're going to say it. Yeah, to buy their land back and probably seed, fertilizer, and equipment to get going. Does that make sense? Now, you're probably thinking, excuse me, well, gee whiz, if they couldn't pay their mortgage, why would this be any better? Well, give me an example. Let's say a farmer owed $100,000 on his farm still, and he lost it. He lost it because his mortgage was over 20 years at 5% interest, which made his payment this much. So the government comes in and he loans that farmer the $100,000 over 50 years with 2.5% interest, which shrinks his payment more than in half, which he can now afford. Does that make sense? That's what they did. So those farmers borrowed money to either buy seed, fertilizer, equipment, etc. to get back on their feet, or they borrowed money to buy back their farm plus those things they needed to operate it. But see the difference? The payment was here. 20-year loan, 5% interest. This is by payment. All of a sudden, the government loans you that money at 50 years at 2.5% interest, and your payment's here. And you can afford to run your farm. Does that make sense? Not only buy it back, we can afford it. It's just like when you buy a home. I chose to finance mine over 15 years, which means I would pay it off sooner, right? If you do it over 30 years, it's going to take you twice as long to pay it. And when you borrow money over 30 years and you make your first payment, what does the majority of that first payment go towards? Principal, interest, or taxes? What? Interest, yeah. Your payment, you might have not hardly, on a $1,000 payment, you might have paid $100 on the principal. The rest went to interest and property tax. The later you get in the loan, when you pay that $1,000 the last year of your loan, most of it goes to principal, a little goes to interest. Because what's the bank want to get out of you? Money, yeah, they want the money up front. So that's how it works. So it's really a brilliant plan by Roosevelt to say, we'll just lend them the money. We'll give them more time to pay and less interest, and we're good to go. That was a brilliant idea, and it got American farmers back in the saddle. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about will be how they dealt with the banking crisis. How they dealt with the banking crisis in America. Okay, because all these banks are in bad shape, aren't they? All these banks are in bad shape. Now, there were two types of banks. Banks that were still functioning and banks that were not. Okay? Now, if you had your money in a bank that was just went belly up, what happened to your money? Gone. But if you had your money in a bank that was still trying to make it, what might you do, Regan? Yeah, you might run down there as quick as you can and get that money out because you don't want to take a chance of losing it. Well, Roosevelt didn't want everybody to run down to these banks that were still barely had their head above water. because as soon as they took all their money out of the bank, what's going to happen to the bank? So what he did is he, by an executive order of the president, declared a bank holiday in which every single functioning bank in the United States was shut down until he said they were open. What does that keep people from doing if the bank's closed? Taking out their money. In those days you couldn't do it with your phone or the computer, right? Transfer, you had to go get it, okay? So he closes the old banks down. Once he closes the banks down with this bank holiday, he talks Congress into passing a law called the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And the purpose behind this act is simply to print money, to give to the banks so they can get back on their feet. But is he going to give it to every single bank that's barely got their head above water? No. In order to get any of this money from the Emergency Banking Relief Act, you had to have at least as much money in the bank as your depositors had put in. Now that's a weird situation, because if I go to Tatum's bank and I put $5,000 in savings, what is Tatum going to do with my $5,000? She's going to give me like 1 or 2% interest, so it's worth my while. But what are you going to do with my money? Yeah, you're going to loan it to Carter, who wants to buy a new car, for 10%, and you're making 8%. So, you know, if you're making enough money and making it work, anytime Tatum comes in and wants her $5,000 with interest, I can give it to her. But if you're barely above water and you don't have the monies in there for the depositors, you're in trouble. So what Roosevelt did, he said, there are 9,000 banks in the United States that he closed that had their head way just barely above water. The only banks he was going to lend money to were the ones that could satisfy their depositors. In other words, they had enough money in the bank to give the person their money back. If you didn't, he shut you down totally. He gave you no money. So of the 9,000 banks that he shut down, 4,000 never got back into business. Only 5,000 of those 9,000 were allowed to reopen. And when they reopened, the federal government gave those 5,000 banks nearly $2 billion in new currency to give Americans faith that the banks could handle their needs. Now, you might, what's that? $2 billion. Now you might think this is crazy, but when people were withdrawing this money out of the bank, before he passed the bank holiday, they were putting it in mattresses, underneath their floorboards, they were digging at holes in their backyards and putting money. I think I told this class about what my mom did with money, because she grew up during the Depression. She was a teenager during the Depression. She didn't really trust banks. Did I ever tell you what she did with cash? Didn't I tell you she put it in tin foil and put it in the freezer? That's what she did. $5,000-6,000 she would have. Because she didn't want to put that in the bank and take the chance that that bank could go belly up. Even in the 1950s and 60s she did this, and 70s. She always had a stash of cash in the freezer. It was incredible. And that all came from the mentality that she was a teenager during the Depression when people lost everything. So again, another brilliant move by Roosevelt to help the banking crisis. And because of these big moves we've talked about, unemployment, farmers, banking, Roosevelt is incredibly popular with the American people. So we'll take that thought into the election of 1936 and see how well he does there. Okay? We know he's going to win, because I told you he was elected 4 terms. But what I tell you in the last election to kind of pay attention to. How many electoral votes he gets. So last time he got like 400 and something, did he not? Okay. Okay, the election of 1936. This is kind of a tough deal, because by 1936, like I mentioned, Roosevelt was incredibly popular.
Are we not going to talk about the Dust Bowl?
No, oh, yeah, I'm going to skip that, but I'll give you a quick Dust Bowl thing. Don't even write this down. The Dust Bowl, what happened in Oklahoma is these farmers grew plants and grew plants and grew crops and grew crops over the land over and over and over again, never giving it a rest. And all of a sudden they had a horrible drought and a horrible windstorm. And you have 2 tornadoes in Oklahoma, and it simply just tore the topsoil off the top. And when it got done after a period of time, it looked like the Sahara Desert. It looked like a desert. This topsoil was simply plunged into piles. And people basically made a mass migration out of Oklahoma, and that really hurt our economy as well. Now, there you go. We'll quit with that, okay? So we'll go to the election of 1936. Now, as I mentioned, because Roosevelt was so popular, the Democrats had no problem renominating him for president. The question was, who was going to be gutsy enough to run against him? And the man the Republican Party nominated was a very good politician, Kansas Governor Alfred Landon. Very good politician. The problem was what? He's running against Roosevelt. So, with a basketball analogy, everybody's talking right now about the poor team that will have to play the Golden State Warriors in the NBA Finals. You know, you're just playing for second place right now because they're definitely going to beat whoever. I don't know if they will, but that's kind of the same thing. But the Republicans made a big effort. Matter of fact, they spent and spent and spent money campaigning to the tune of about $9 million they spent on this election, which would be like spending $166 million today, which probably wouldn't be uncommon, but that was a lot of money, $9 million to spend on a campaign in 1936. Whereas Roosevelt and the Democrats didn't spend even half that, not even close. But what the Republicans did is they went out and said, you know, if we spend enough money, do enough advertising, do enough campaigning, maybe we can get this thing turned around. How do you think it worked for them? Any good? Let me tell you the electoral count in this election. Roosevelt, 523. Landon, 8. Which tells you that how much did each electoral vote cost the Republican Party? Over $1 million electoral vote. Kind of a waste of money, but that tells you the power of Franklin Roosevelt. 523 to 8. The only time an election was worse was in 1820. Anybody remember what happened in 1820 in that election? James Monroe ran. Why would this one be worse than this butt kicking we just talked about? Anybody remember who ran against James Monroe in 1820? Come on. Nobody. Remember, he ran unopposed. No, remember, he ran unopposed. So this is the worst election defeat. The only one worse was a guy that didn't even run against anybody else. So this just tells you the power of FDR. I mean, he just crushed him. And the Republicans ended up paying, over $1 million a vote. Now, Roosevelt's second term went pretty good, except something happened in 1938 that's going to set the stage for a new chapter in American history. What happened in 1938 during his second term? How? Germany invaded Poland in 1938, which led to a world war in Europe that again we're going to try to stay out of, but can't after the events of what? Yeah, Pearl Harbor. So we try to stay out from 38 to December 7th of 1941, but when the Japanese attack the United States in Hawaii, we're in, right? Okay, just keep that in mind. Our next subtopic then is some important, I'm going to tell you 4 important things that happened during Roosevelt's second term. What's going to happen in his third term? We're going to go to war. And that'll be next year's first right off the bat topic. What'd you say? What'd you say? You'd just rather not have it on tape? Okay. So here's the first important national event that happened during Roosevelt's second term. We saw it on the video. Anybody want to tell me what it was? The video started right up. As soon as I pushed play, you could see what it was. You had these cars that were driving at you. What were they driving over? Which one? The Golden Gate Bridge. So on May 28th of 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California was completed. It became the largest suspension bridge in the world. And according to Cody Butterfield, last class, it stretched for all the way from San Francisco to Long Island. He had his geography off a little. That would have been the longest suspension bridge in American history from one end to the... So he was a little off, but God bless him, he tried. Good job, Cody. The cost of that bridge was $35 million. And it took 5 years to build, but what did it really allow people to have during that 5-year construction? Jobs. Hired a lot of people to work at good pay. So that was another thing that happened that Roosevelt helped the unemployment crisis. That bridge building for 5 years employed a lot of people at good salary. Now, your question might be, I wonder if they had any fatalities building that bridge. Well, they estimated that one worker was killed for each $1 million they spent on building the bridge, which tells you that about how many people were killed? 35, okay? So about 35 people, I think it was 35 people that lost their lives during the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. But it did bring in a ton of money into the economy and solved a lot of unemployment problems as well. The second thing, and you'll be amazed at this, the second thing that happened during Roosevelt's second term is he raised the minimum wage. Wow, everybody was excited. Anybody know how much he raised it to an hour? Come on, Galen. Three what? $3.25? Well, I'm just asking, it's a guess. What do you, anybody else have a guess? How about the last part of that answer? 25 cents an hour. And that, yeah, that's what he raised it to, and that was, everybody was happy. That'd be like $4.63 an hour today. You wouldn't like that. But that was pretty good raise those days. So he raised the minimum wage to 25 cents an hour. And he also did this for the first time in history. He limited the number of hours an employee could work a week to 40